Great, thank you for the introduction. All right, so let me get right into it. So yeah, I'll be presenting on the use of scientific authority when examining misinformation spread on Twitter. This is work that I've done in the Global Health Policy and Data Institute at UC San Diego, as well as a grad student at UCSD Cognitive Science. So more specifically, I'm going to be talking about misinformation related to hydroxychloroquine as an effective treatment for COVID-19, and mostly exploring the discourse on Twitter. So just for some background, so on July 27th, 2020, US President Trump at the time retweeted a video that falsely claimed that using hydroxychloroquine was a cure for COVID-19, despite well-documented evidence saying otherwise. And Trump's retweet is also related to the broader COVID-19 infodemic, declared by the WHO pretty early on in the early stages of the pandemic, which involves deliberate attempts to disseminate wrong information that undermines public health response. And this study is looking at a particular form of misinformation that uses scientific credibility to back its claims. So I'll kind of go into more detail of what that means, but essentially kind of trying to distinguish a different type of category of misinformation. So then also just for some further background of the hydroxychloroquine discourse on Twitter. So here's a chart where on the y-axis is the number of tweets that have the word hydroxy or hydroxychloroquine in it. And then the x-axis is the calendar dates. So as you can see on July 27th, shortly after Trump retweeted the viral hydroxy video, that the number of hydroxy tweets spiked pretty shortly after. And we also looked at another data source from the Stanford Cable TV News Analyzer. This is a publicly available data set. It's free, where they basically just take 24/7 transcriptions of CNN, Fox, and MSNBC, and it allows users to basically query different search terms and keywords or grouping of keywords to see kind of what mainstream media outlets are reporting. And by the orange box for the study time frame, so not only did Trump's retweet impact the discourse on Twitter, but it also bled into the larger media ecosystem and influenced, how hydroxy reporting on more traditional mainstream media. And then I also kind of want to go over a brief history of scientific evidence being used for misinformation spread and promoting false claims, because hydroxychloroquine definitely isn't the first instance, or even just COVID-19 in general, where scientific authority has been used to back false claims. So for some examples, there is the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, the TIRC, which was formed in 1953. And it was pretty explicit in that it was formed for the sole purpose of undermining the general consensus that smoking is bad for you and can basically kill people. And by 1986, had spent over $130 million on sponsored research, resulting in 2,600 published articles. And these are the 1986 numbers, so it's 2021 now. So it's very likely that, these numbers have increased. Then there's also Edward Bernays, also known as the father of public relations. And he's pretty infamous about using scientific authority and scientific credibility signifiers for promoting, questionable economic or product claims. He was also the nephew of Sigmund Freud, as a side note. It's a very interesting person to look at, in general. And he also worked a lot in propaganda during World War II, which I think also it influenced a lot of the public relations that he kind of built in later. But so essentially, he wanted to influence how Americans' breakfast eating habits, because one of his clients was the bacon industry. So he was able to find. So this in his memoir, he states that he was able to find a physician willing to state publicly that a hearty breakfast, which included bacon, was healthier than a lighter breakfast, with the full knowledge that a large number of people will follow the advice of their doctors. So not only using the scientific, like the medical authority to promote the claim, but also being very explicit about it. There's also another instance, and I'm picking on Bernays, but there's a lot of other people who've done this too. But he's kind of a little more of the most infamous example. But so there was an episode on The Late Show with David Letterman in 1985 where Bernays was on, and Letterman introduced Bernays as Dr. Bernays. And then Letterman asked, what is a doctor in? And Bernays replies, what we're dealing here really is the concept that people will believe me more if you call me doctor. So again, not only that they're there's an intentionality, like there is kind of knowing what they're doing, and it's not necessarily being kept a secret either, especially kind of going on national television and being very explicit about it. And then looking into the literature on misinformation in general, I was interested in just kind of seeing like what work out there that kind of looks explicitly at scientific authority and misinformation spreading dynamics. And I wasn't really able to find much. There was just one study that looked at how deference and just like respect towards scientific authority was influenced by media. There was another study that looked at scientific authority drives support for biotechnology. But again, nothing that really talks about scientific credibility or scientific credibility signifiers being used to promote false claims. And I also noticed that, like, kind of going through the literature, there's a lot of variety in how misinformation is defined. So there's a lot of studies that look at, we'll basically take like, questionable scientific posts or maybe even like pseudoscientific posts, and then basically ask people like, would you share this on your network? So like this example here, I have from a study that I saw that, they use this example, like to move your cactus in front of a computer monitor so it avoids electromagnetic fields. So I guess, it's trying to get at like a bit of a pseudoscience-y, construct. Although granted, I also do kind of wonder if that statement is completely scientifically false, because I mean, technically sunlight is also electromagnetic waves. So I mean, by putting a plant in front of a computer, I don't know, but I would say that this is a pretty qualitatively different form of misinformation compared to something more contemporary, like the COVID-19 vaccine has microchips. And especially when talking about misinformation, like there's a lot of categories of is this information that maybe just a lot of people don't know a lot about, and that it's just easier to put false claims just because people don't have knowledge to kind of try to assess the veracity of the claim, versus is it more of a politicized nature of the misinformation, and is there like some exactly like more explicit political motivation going on? So kind of by going through the literature review, some questions that I wanted this study to answer is just, is misinformation using scientific authority more prominent than just accurate scientific evidence within like a, like Twitter discourse? And then also, what types of users are the ones who are spreading misinformation, or who are the most influential on it? And then also looking at just misinformation on Twitter more generally. Usually previous work the consensus is that misinformation is pretty prevalent on Twitter. These two studies were from 2018. So this one found that, they looked at 126,000 rumors spread by around 3 million people on Twitter between 2006 to 2017. And they showed that false news on Twitter spread further and more broadly than true stories. And this effect was particularly pronounced for political news. Again, also kind of showing the need for distinguishing that, like, misinformation that has a politicized element to it. Since it does seem like even other stuff that I've looked at for other social media work, it does seem like political discourse does have its own specific type of dynamic to it compared to other topics on at least for Twitter studies. And then also another study, looked at misinformation on Twitter and reported that the misinformation reappeared multiple times after its initial publication, while true facts did not. So not only that the misinformation was more prevalent in terms of volume from the first study, but also that the misinformation had a higher duration as well. So in general, this, another question I wanted to be answered by this project was, is misinformation within the hydroxy discourse similar to what these studies have reported? And also, just as a quick side note before moving off the slide, both these studies are 2018, so that's 2 years before COVID and pre-infodemic. So it's also kind of noteworthy of like the misinformation was prevalent even before, it's like the current form of it. And, and from further slides, you'll definitely see kind of what the current state of misinformation is. So now I'll kind of dig into the methods of this project and kind of go into the main findings. So we took in 2,289,441 tweets from the Twitter API using hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine as keywords, and we had the time frame between July 21st to the 31st. So this was kind of has two dates that hold the 27th when Trump sent his tweet. So a couple of days before he sent his tweet, a couple of days after. Then we took all these tweets, so also to not have to code all 2 million plus tweets, we used a NLP approach or topic modeling called this. In this case, it was BITERM topic model that generates the similar text into the same set of topics, and it's particularly well suited for short text documents such as tweets that have the 280 character limit. Then we took these topic clusters and we took the top 10 most retweeted tweets from each topic cluster and then manually coded to identify scientific authority themes. And we looked at 2 misinformation themes and then 1 control group of just accurate scientific information. So the misinformation themes are in red, the control group is in blue. So we have medical endorsements is one theme that we looked for. So just whether someone states, like as a doctor or as a research scientist, I support the use of hydroxy for treating COVID-19. Then we have another category for supportive scientific evidence. So this is just a scientific study or scientific finding, or at least claiming to be, that supports the use of hydroxy for treating COVID. And then opposing scientific evidence. So as findings or results that oppose hydroxy use. And then topic clusters that had at least 50% of these of the tweet volume that were related to these scientific authority themes were then selected for further analysis. And then just to kind of go in a little bit more detail of the BITERM topic model for those who might be interested, especially of using NLP for social media research. So BTM uses what's called the BITERM as opposed to more traditional NLP approaches like LDA, or I think LDA is like the big one for topic modeling that uses unigrams or bigrams, where BITERM is a combination of 2 words where here's an example where it's like go to school is the phrase, and then it'll be turned into 3 biterms. So it'll break it out to go to, go school, and then to school. And this is to kind of capture the co-occurrence of the words, and that's how it basically measures the textual similarity between the texts. And then BTM splits all the text into a bag of words, produces a discrete probability distribution for all the words for each theme, and then places a larger weight on words that are most representative of a given theme. And then since this is an unsupervised machine learning approach, we have to set the number of topics that we're looking for. So to do this, we calculate what we call a coherence score. And this basically measures how strong the top words correspond to its respective topic to help determine the number of total topics in general. So for this study, we set it to k equals 30 topics. And this was based on the coherence score. And then I did mention the scientific authority themes that we looked for, but here's a little bit more of an in-depth description. Medical endorsements, evoking medical authority or expertise when supporting the use of hydroxy, scientific support. So I guess scientific evidence we formally define as just scientific evidence as findings obtained by scientific method or scientific instruments based on the scientific theories used to prove a specific claim. And we use that definition of scientific evidence for both the supportive scientific hydroxy theme and then these, opposing scientific authority theme. And here are examples of tweets that go with each of the categories that we coded for. So on the top, we have medical endorsement. So an example of that is, a Texas doctor reports how he was intimidated and bullied by his local medical boards for successfully treating patients with hashtag hydroxychloroquine. HCQ works, but there's no money in it for big pharma. Hashtag hydroxychloroquine works. A scientific support tweet example is we have more evidence presented for why hydroxychloroquine should be made available in a new court filing by the Association of American Physicians and Surgeons. That sounds like a pretty medical authority organization to me. Then we have the scientific opposition. We have this one, all caps, debunking hydroxychloroquine again. And then they said that viral HCQ video today, this is referring to the video that Trump retweeted. And then he said the user says, it's time to bump up the thread on the mega recovery randomized trial of HCQ with 4,700 people showing no benefit from mortality and even higher risk of ventilator mortality. We also coded for positive and negative sentiment. So this is kind of more general, where it's not necessarily misinformation, but just basically seeing if the tweet just basically expresses a positive attitude towards using hydroxy versus a negative attitude. So examples for this is, we have viruses mutate, a vaccine is a fool's errand, treat the symptoms, prescribe hydroxy, work on herd immunity, keep high risk isolated from herd. negative sentiment, we have the drug doesn't work as a prophylaxis, as a preventative. It doesn't work in the treatment of early disease, and it very convincingly doesn't work in hospitalized patients. We can definitely say that hydroxychloroquine doesn't work. So, this tweet takes a very hard stance for opposition for hydroxy. So now we have results. So here are the topic clusters that we looked at for analysis. So again, we had the 30 total topics that we looked at, then using an inductive coding scheme and then also coding for sentiment, we narrowed it down to 8 topics in total. These are the first 4 on this slide, the next 4 on the other slide. And these are the topic clusters that had at least 50% of its tweets related to one of these scientific authority themes. So I included the topic cluster and then also just the 3 top retweeted tweets just to kind of give a sense of, what, or a flavor of what those topics were like. The main point, and also in terms of color coding too, in case people are wondering, the red topics are topics that are predominantly medical endorsements. The blue are predominantly scientific support, and then the green are the scientific opposition. And the main interest for these slides, especially on a methodological standpoint, is the second column that is a percent top 10 retweet. So this is essentially indicates how much of, by just looking at the top 10 retweets of that topic cluster, how much does that explain for the rest of the tweets within that topic cluster based on the retweet volume. So as you can see, for most of the topics, or for all the topics, at least 50% of the discourse was described by the top 10 retweeted tweets. But for most of the topics in general, they're usually in the 60, 70 to even 80% range of using the top 10 tweets to characterize the discourse. So just kind of adding a little bit of showing a little bit of validation for using this approach for just analyzing themes within a giant discourse that has, for instance, like 2 million plus tweets by only really having to code for like 300. Yeah, that was, And then so in general, on an overall level, of the 532,199 users that were associated with the data set, 88.3% were engaged in topics that express predominantly positive sentiment towards hydroxy, compared to only 5.5% that expressed a negative sentiment. And then of the 2 million plus tweets that were associated with this data set, 18.04% were within topics featuring a medical endorsement for hydroxy. 1.34% featured scientific evidence supporting hydroxy use for COVID-19. And then less than 1%, 0.51%, featured opposing scientific evidence. So in general, in terms of misinformation prevalence, there's a lot more, much more hydroxy misinformation on Twitter compared to the opposing or accurate scientific information. And in general, also the general sentiment of hydroxy was predominantly positive. Then also here, we analyzed the topic clusters a little bit further. We used a metric we developed in a previous study called an echo score. And essentially, we created this metric just to kind of see of just how much does the same message word for word just is replicated throughout a discourse. So we calculate this by just taking the total number of tweets for each topic cluster and then dividing it by the number of unique tweets. And by unique tweets, it's just the, unique in terms of text. So just, how much is it just like carbon copy identical? So just looking at the table on the top and just comparing the average echo scores of the medical endorsement themes compared to the scientific opposition themes, there was a higher echo score in general compared to scientific opposition, which indicates that there's a lot more consistency in the messaging for the misinformation themes compared to the accurate scientific evidence. And then we also looked at a time graph of the misinformation spread, just to kind of look at the duration component as well, since we were looking at the volume for the previous analysis. And as you can see, there's the green line, that's the scientific opposition. And if you kind of really lean in to your computer screen, you can see that there's about 2 peaks really early up in the beginning, and then it kind of tapers down, where the misinformation themes have multiple peaks throughout the discourse. So not only is it kind of reiterating that the misinformation themes are higher in volume compared to scientific opposition, but in this case as well, the duration of the misinformation occurred at more time frequencies as well. And then for this analysis, we looked at the top 10 most retweeted accounts that were associated. So these were basically of the tweets, of the top 10 retweeted tweets that we coded, who are the accounts that basically produced them. And we did this by just looking at publicly available metadata, so just basically information that they would put on their like public profile description on their profile. And we coded for just basically just affiliations. So we looked at whether that they reported that they were affiliated with the media, whether that they were a journalist or worked for a TV show or something like that. We looked at MD or scientist, so whether they stated explicitly that they were, had an MD or a research scientist on their profile. We also looked at whether they were a political organization or a politician. And then we also looked for whether or not they were a Trump supporter, especially since, Trump was the one who kind of initiated the full hydroxy discourse. So we felt like that would be a pretty relevant variable. And we operationalized Trump support by just if there was just an explicit indicator that they supported Trump. So this would just be something like, they have hashtag Trump 2020, hashtag MAGA, or like on their profile description, or if they just have like a picture of Trump like on their profile picture or cover photo. So as you can see, we have the medical endorsement theme, scientific support, and scientific opposition. And there's a lot more influence and involvement from Trump supporters in medical endorsements and scientific support. Also, a lot more involvement from media and political orgs as well for the medical endorsements and scientific support themes. While the scientific opposition theme, I guess maybe not too surprisingly, or maybe it is surprisingly, but like, it is a high involvement of MDs and scientists. So that's actually a little bit heartening that, like scientists who are on Twitter are making the effort. Although, like it seems like basically they are kind of driving most of the effort in general. And then for those who might be wondering about that 10% of Trump supporters in the scientific opposition theme, so we did do a deep dive into that. And it's not a case where it was a Trump supporter who was being anti-hydroxy. In this case, it was just someone who was being pro-hydroxy, but they were just the minority voice within the particular discourse that they were in. So yeah, in general, just kind of, you can see that there is some variety of just like how much the types of users are even kind of influencing what type of discourses are going on. So for just a brief summary of the findings, so the majority of the hydroxy Twitter discourse revolved around topics that express positive sentiment towards its use, misinformation evoking scientific authority, such as medical endorsements and supportive scientific evidence, was much more prevalent than opposing scientific evidence. And this was pretty much consistent with the previous 2018 studies mentioned earlier, since the hydroxy misinformation was higher in volume and also had a higher duration. So it's consistent with previous findings of misinformation. And topics featuring misinformation were influenced by politically motivated accounts, at least within the case for hydroxy. And then to also kind of bring up some, so like after kind of going over, like misinformation is prevalent, that, there's a little bit of a dire tone to it. And I've given this version of this talk where I would kind of end on like, all right, like misinformation is the default and call it a day. But to avoid having a, kind of ending on a gloom and doom note, I figured kind of talking about some ways to mitigate misinformation spread and kind of counteract, the prevalence of it. So previous researchers who are in the misinformation space, they come up with different claims. So there's one, there's like a misinformation handbook that was made by Lewandowski, and she argued for a like pre-bunking claims. So the idea would be like if you anticipate that there might be misinformation about a particular topic, then kind of like getting ahead of it and kind of already putting in the accurate information and kind of like setting the tone before, like the misinformation becomes prevalent. I've seen more recent research that challenges the efficacy of pre-bunking as a way to like mitigate misinformation susceptibility. But I can also see a case where it is probably pretty contextual as well. And kind of getting at the like the different, like, kind of what I mentioned earlier of like, there's a lot of different variety of misinformation. So I could also see pre-bunking maybe being effective for some types of misinformation, but maybe not for others. They also mentioned setting your own talking points. So again, just kind of controlling the narrative and like kind of using your terminology and making sure that's the the terminology being used in the discourse, as opposed to like letting the opposition side setting the terminology. And then also just directly attacking like underlying logical fallacies. So like if someone is spreading a misinformation claim, like kind of breaking down like in a logical but like respectful fashion of like why that claim is factually incorrect. Other researchers have mentioned using NLP for detecting fake news articles or like misinformation. And there's also been calls for actions for other researchers to make publicly available textual data with labeled fake news articles to build a comprehensive training data set. I have some mixed thoughts of this. I kind of feel like, and this is also kind of what I've been bringing up, before, is that misinformation is a pretty contextual phenomena. That I think in a case where it might be really difficult to have a truly comprehensive training data set that can really predict all current forms of misinformation and then also all upcoming new forms of misinformation. And like just some of the examples of what I'm kind of trying to get at is like, for instance, like, the scientific consensus is like an always changing thing. And like, even for hydroxy, like in the super early stages of hydroxy, there were some scientific evidence and studies that were, being suggested that it could be a treatment. But then it was only until the more like confirmatory, more, robust studies that said otherwise, where then it was, the definitive statement was, or the stance was made more defined. But a misinformation algorithm is going to then have to then be updated with a new training set, essentially, to basically anticipate that, like, okay, well, now the definition of misinformation for this particular case has changed. And then also just different types of misinformation being tricky. So, are you talking about, like, oh, is a cactus being in front of a computer screen to avoid electromagnetic waves? Or are you talking about a super politicized type of misinformation that might even have, political actors actively trying to spread it? Or just like, there's more ulterior motives for it versus just kind of like a, like, is this just a fact that people just might have trouble understanding and there's just a lot of ways to misinterpret it? And then, so with the training data having to be updated so frequently, it does kind of make me wonder if like the effort of having a new training set, it might just be easier to just have human coders than to just kind of like, look at what's the current form of misinformation, or at least how misinformation is being defined within the study of interest that people are looking at. And then, a suggestion that we came up with in our paper was just, recruiting celebrities and influencers, and maybe even utilizing Twitter bots just as a way to disseminate accurate scientific information. So kind of taking advantage of those who have either, large networks or have a high influence on these social networks, and kind of recruiting them for maybe public health efforts, perhaps, just as a disseminator of accurate information. And on a lesser extent, bots too, especially since they can be used to be able to disseminate a lot of messages at a quick amount of time. So kind of taking advantage of that as well, or maybe like spamming for the greater good. So yeah, just for some final thoughts, it can be difficult to assess the credibility of a study or statistic on social media platforms. And I think this is true even for people who have formal scientific and statistical training. So like, even for people who are scientists, I think it is very difficult to kind of assess truly of the, the veracity of a, piece of evidence that comes up on a newsfeed. And also like, so like, especially if it's something outside of your field too. So, this effect will only be doubly so for people who don't even have who don't have the formal training in science as well. So kind of really making that like, the need for looking at this particular form of misinformation, just because it is pretty difficult to kind of assess. So future research should focus on misinformation that uses scientific credibility for making false claims, and then to help come up and identify specific strategies that can target this particularly viral form of misinformation. And that's what I got.